come to Science 9, we're going to use our final pair of books, QED by Richard Feynman, Quantum Electrodynamics, and The Nature of Space and Time, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. What is interesting, and by the way, the book, The Nature of Space and Time, is augmented by these three videos. And we'll try and make these videos available for you so that you will get a chance to at least see them in action. The difficulty is that by the early 21st century, it is not possible to understand what is going on any of the levels in the world without a education like the one that we are now coming to complete, a cycle. In nature, there is a natural world. And that natural world very easily accommodates a cultural world which rather floats on top of it. And from time to time, they'll have a synergy, they'll have an interpenetration. If there is some kind of a confusion in the cultural world, it can be retuned to nature by going back to nature. And that tuning is the ritual cycle, which will follow the natural cycle, generally of the year or of the season, and even a cultural time frame like the week can be adjusted so that the weeks add up to the months following the moon cycle, and the months adding up to the year following the sun's cycle. And so natural integrals are all cyclic. They have a periodicity. And that periodicity is not only in the process of the natural world and in the process of the cultural world as well. One can have the ceremonial cycle as well as the natural cycle. But it is also connected. They are held together by the ritual specificity of existentiality. The things that exist, the plants, the animals, the minerals, the people, life, birth, death, maturity, all of this holds that together. And in this way, existence and ritual action, not just karma as something unavoidable, but ritual action as karma which is necessary to keep the natural and the cultural worlds so that their processes, their cycles, are referentiable. And that referentiality takes place in paralleling nature and culture so that the ritual cycle is paralleled naturally by a symbol cycle in the mind. And so symbols and rituals have a referentiality of not just their mutual referentiality, which would be an identity, that what you do and what you think, if they are linked together in a mutual referentiality, the proof of it will be an identity. One of the curious things, though, is that in thought, the ultimate identity is posited in a way in which it is not just identity, but is actually what is called in logic a tautology. A equals A. And if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C as well. So that the identification is actually an expansion of the tautology, and the certainty is carried in the equal sign, which is then the notation symbolically, not for an entity but for a relationality. And so the mind is very comfortable in the natural cycle, in the natural integral, with making things out of existence and existentials symbolized in the mind, and that symbolic notation carries over into a notation for relationalities and processes as well. And not just an equal sign, but you can use a reverse in an inverted V, less than, or greater than, or a little tilde related to many other things. A colon, that they're paralleled in such a way that there is a gap between them, but that the gap does not interfere with a special kind of relationship to them, and many other notations. The difficulty comes with consciousness, with vision. Dreams can be worked into the cultural world, but visions cannot. Consciousness cannot be worked into the natural integral without the natural integral undergoing a transformation. And that this transformation then takes the cyclic integral and puts a new spin on it. And that this spin has, in fact, its own kind of symmetry, but it is not a symmetry of parallel, of co. It's not a symmetry of disparateness, contra, but the symmetry that conscious transform brings into play is of a different ordering altogether. And one of the most difficult things for us to appreciate is that the current reality that is actually obtaining an operative is all but invisible to most human beings on the planet. They do not understand it, they do not see it, they do not hear it. They bounce off any kind of presentation of it and any kind of in-depth understanding. Literally, they blank out. You can see for yourself what happens in a learning situation like this when we get to science. It is a very difficult thing, but it is rather a universal quality in nature that you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Not only will the genie not fit, the genie will not go. Once you have rubbed that bottle and got the magic going and the genie comes out, the genie is there to transform things, not just to fulfill wishes, but to make nature into what it is that you would like to have, that you would like to envision, that you would like to change, and magic can happen. And consciousness is like that. One of the difficulties in the 20th century was that in the decade just before it, in the 1890s, there was such a lunge into a visionary dimension, not just a vision that someone would have from the culture or from one's symbolic mind, but it was a vision that was shared throughout the planet in a number of areas, collecting in two special kinds of forms, the arts and the sciences. Vision does not come out of the cultural world. It does not come out of the natural world. We say of consciousness or of vision, it's magic, it's supernatural, it's transcendent, it's other than. But there is a quality of relationality that is familiar, and so vision engenders what finally could be said by the early 21st century, following many developments in the 20th century. It engenders the social world. That a society is not a thing, but it's an ongoing process, best characterized as the social world, and is like a third realm. That there is the natural world, there is the cultural world, then there is the social world. And that just as the cultural world develops in its own kind of parallel with the natural world, looking back to it, grounding itself in it, the social world increasingly in its differential conscious process looks forward. It looks forward to another process which would be not just parallel to it, but would be in a resonance with it, would eventually, that all the groupings in the process of the social world would have resonant groupings in a fourth world, and that this fourth world is the historical world. So that now we have a pair of pairs. We have a square of processes. We have the natural world and the cultural world. We have the social world and the historical world. But whereas the first two worlds, nature and culture, tend to come together, tend to make an integral, the differential worlds tend to go further and further into expansions of possibility, of complexity. And what happens here increasingly is that while some elements in the natural world, some elements in the cultural world are transformed by vision and further deepened in the transform when art forms come out of the visionary process. The historical world transforms even deeper, wider, more complexities in the natural order, and the science forms that come out of the historical world process increasingly transform all of the natural cycle as a whole, as a unity, as an integral, as a oneness, eventually as a singularity. The most outstanding person in the 20th century to grapple with this in the first half of it was Albert Einstein. And the most captivating individual who grappled with it in the second half of the 20th century is Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant mathematical theorists to ever live, accentuated in such an arcane, rare, unique way that it almost seems as if it were some kind of paradoxical planned gift to mankind. Hawking was born in 1942 because of the Second World War and the bombing by the Nazis of London to terrify the population. His mother went to Oxford to have the baby because the Nazis had made a rare promise not to bomb Oxford or Cambridge because of the universities if the British and the Allies would not bomb Heidelberg and Göttingen in Germany. And oddly enough, the pact was kept, and those 4 university towns remained unbombed. At any rate, Stephen Hawking was born there, and then within months moved back to London. And in the bombing, in the Blitz, at that time, it was a very difficult childhood to come into. Hawking himself was an extraordinary kind of a child, thin, fragile, withdrawn, not at all athletic, not interested in boys' things, interested seemingly in nothing whatsoever, of just getting by, and not being interested led to a sort of reputation that he was a ne'er-do-well, that he really didn't fit in, that he was gawky, he was awkward. When he was 8, the family moved about 20 miles west of London to St. Albans, an old Roman town made famous by Sir Francis Bacon back in the early 17th century. When it came time for Hawking to go to university, he had been so well prepared, and he wanted to really be taken in on the highest levels. He finally was able to get admittance to Oxford University, where it just didn't challenge him, and so he hardly participated at all. He would wait until the final hours. One story is that 3 friends of his, a roommate and several other friends, worked all week, and between the 3 of them they solved one problem that had been given the week before in the tutorial. And Hawking was seen just reading science fiction all week. And just a couple of hours before the tutorial was to meet again, they saw that Hawking had brought some of his work, and they said, "Well, what have you done?" He said, "I only had time to solve 9 of the problems." And he was completely bored. One of the things that he looked for in a university education was that he wanted to study with one of the great cosmic philosophers and astronomers of the time, Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle's little Nature of the Universe paperback sold millions of copies. I remember reading it at 12 years of age. This is the first printing, January 1955. And I tried to read the hardcover in junior high, and it wasn't until 1955, when I was 14, that I was able to finally read the whole book and understand what a great man Fred Hoyle was. He was a science fiction author as well. But Hawking was not able to study under Hoyle. He was instead given the assignment that his major before that, his major professor had been a man named Berman, Stuart Berman. And later on, his major professor became Dennis Sciama, who is one of the world's great cosmologists. His famous book, The Unity of the Universe, not the nature of the universe, but the unity of the universe. And eventually, he became interested in a kind of a modern cosmology, not the nature of the universe, but the nature of the study of the cosmos. And finally, just a few years before he passed on, modern cosmology and the dark matter problem. And one of the things that Sciama was interested in was the work of a genius who was born in 1931 named Roger Penrose. And Roger Penrose was one of the most extraordinary figures. He was teaching at Birkbeck College in London. And one of the things that was being given to Hawking before he went to Oxford was to be included in some trips down to London to hear some of the presentations and talks. And one of the talks that he heard was by Roger Penrose, talking about the problem of cosmology centering around what were called singularities, and that these singularities would eventually be named black holes, and that this was one of the most central problems because it meant that the integral of the nature of the universe in its cycle could condense and collapse and come to be one thing which no longer was able to be detected in nature. That nature's ultimate integral, a singularity, a oneness, blanks out of perceptual and conceptual, blanks out of the natural world, blanks out of the cultural world, and makes a challenge to the social world of consciousness, where it is a puzzle as long as the social world of consciousness is rooted to the old referentiality of the cycles of nature and still linked to the kinds of identifications that happen between the mind and the body. And that as long as the social world is co-opted by the mind as just an embellishment further by the mind's own integrals, by the mind's ideas raised to ideologies, by the mind's images that are brought together in the imagination, that the social world is an advancement by the mind of the cultural world, and therefore the social world is in the same bar of development, of progress, of measurability as the natural world. And so the social world will have also its own kind of more complex, but will have its own kind of identifications, its own kind of referentialities. But something tricky happens in that whole ecology, which was never visible either as something that could be appreciated personally or could be analyzed scientifically. And the following is this, which our education, for the first time, makes apparent. The natural integral when it is given form, instead of having a circular cycle, it tends to have a framed square of referentiality. The process is a circle, but the form is a square, is a frame of reference. And one thing about a frame is that ordinarily in the natural world and the cultural world, in the ritual existence of things, in the symbolic ideas of things, the total integral can very easily be put into the form of a frame, the picture. Anything within that frame is what we're looking at. And that the frame of what we're looking at composes itself in terms of that frame. Not only a frame of reference, but a frame of the composition. But as soon as you move to a new fifth phase, the framing no longer can contain a five-fold process, nor a five-fold form, without a very in-depth transformation. And the transformation consists in this, that the first of the phases in the frame bows out of the frame. It bows out of the ability to compose attention, not only to see, but to hear, to relate to have a certainty with. And so nature goes out of the square of attention, out of the frame of reference, and visionary consciousness comes in and occupies not its place so much, but occupies a new place. It's not that nature disappears, but nature now, being out of the frame of reference, being out of the square of attention, becomes literally non-conscious. Or, to use the term that was developed over about 150 years in European thought, it becomes unconscious. So now with the advent of a consciousness, with the social world, there is also the advent of a shadow of that social world, the natural unconscious. There is a shadow of the emergence of existence, so that there is now a negative of existence which has thingness. And so any kind of a program of developing consciousness in an extension of the natural cycle will inadvertently, inescapably, indescribably create a whole plethora of problems. The problem now that there is an unconscious, how can we relate to it? The problem now is that the individual has a negative alter ego, Mr. Hyde to one's Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll, has a shadow to one's ego, has an anti-natural actuality, how to relate to that, how to bring that into play. And also one has lost contact with nature, such that the mind and body now occupy, instead of being twin emergent forms out of an integral cycle, the body occurs as the originator of the entire frame of reference. It's first. And so ritual action of the body becomes the basis upon which the whole frame of reference is made, and it becomes completely understandable how an ideology of materialism would develop out of that. Because one is not looking to the mysterious process of nature to originate one's frame of reference. One is looking to the materia of the existential world. But the existential world is an emergence from the natural world, not the natural world. Worlds are processes of phase. And so what one has is the traction of the cultural world founds itself on ritual materiality. Now, as soon as art forms begin to come out of the social world, out of the visionary consciousness, those art forms are extremely powerful, but in a differential mode. They are like jewels. They are like prisms. And instead of just being existence, now they're kaleidoscopic forms that have the ability to prism rather than to be just pragmatic. They're prismatic. Existence forever is a pragmatic, it's what you do, the steps you take, make that objectivity. But in a prismatic form, it is the spectrum and not the sequence of the steps that determines how that form works, and it doesn't work to integrate, it works to further differentiate, to open up. And unless art is co-opted back into the ritual cycle and becomes just another ritual exercise, it will eventually do what vision did as a phase for nature. It will take the ritual phase out of the frame of reference so that it no longer operates in the square of attention. It no longer is in the frame of reference. And what happens is a crisis of the mind, because its whole comfortability with referentiality and identity is always going back to the body. Whereas real difficulties for the artist is always that they are interested in their art and not their body. Two cases in point, Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Only in Einstein's case, he was a natural artist, not in oils or sculpting. He was a natural artist in mathematical theory. And Stephen Hawking became his successor as an artist in theory, because as soon as he began to really realize that there were actual problems that needed to be solved, he began to suffer from a debilitating disease for which there is no cure. It's sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease in the United States. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's like a multiple sclerosis where you lose on the level of your spinal column and your brain cells the ability to control motor neuron motion. And so in England, sometimes it's called motor neuron disease. And as that atrophies more and more, it leaves the higher functions of the brain completely free. And so he found himself, just as he discovered that there are real problems, and the first real problem he found was in a lecture by Roger Penrose talking about singularities. That the natural cycle can integrate itself to a oneness, and when it does, it obviates all of the known laws of nature in its limited quality, not just its limited quality in terms of existential space, but also existential time. And because of the great transform of making space and time come together, it meant that space-time itself, when it comes into singularity, into oneness, obviates the ability for the mind to adequately deal with it, because the mind now is included in the integral of the singularity, and it has to operate literally outside of itself in order to do this. On the train home from London with his fellow students, staring out the window, worrying about the fact that he was going to obviously die young, that there was no cure for this, it suddenly occurred to him, how would you work out the math if you considered the entire universe a singularity? And it suddenly struck him, for the first time in his life, that this was a noble, worthy challenge for his talents, and that every ounce of his ingenuity would have to be brought into play. But would he live long enough to be able to successfully plumb that and come up with the answer? And as he did so, as he began atrophying more and more, as at the same time the problem of the singularity of the universe grew, the only mediating person was a young woman named Jane, also from St. Albans, interested in him and interested in being with him, even knowing the prognosis. And it was her feminine quality of person that brought a new prismatic quality into Stephen Hawking and drew forth his person for the first time in his life. And one of the realities in this is that while processes in nature are feminine and the forms in nature are masculine, in consciousness, the forms are feminine and the processes are masculine. This is how they're able to come into a very grand double complementarity. Because the forms of consciousness, being feminine, fit very beautifully in with the forms of nature, and the processes of nature fit in very well with the processes of consciousness, and you get the double quality that we usually symbolize by the infinity sign. In one of the most mysterious things, Stephen Hawking would never have been able to still be alive. He'll be 64 coming up in January, if it hadn't been for her, that she was able to interface with him in such a way that the differential prism of his person was able to rise up out of the debilitation of the body and bring the mind with it into a new complementarity, so that his masculine mind and his feminine prismatic person were able finally to work together and to allow him to be able, for the first time, to really look at the cosmos as a unity. It wasn't that the universe is just a singularity, but that it occurs within something more expansive and interesting. The universe as a singularity is a masculine symbolic form, but the cosmos as an infinity is a feminine form. And it's this intuition that has allowed Hawking to do something that almost no scientist has ever done. He has written books that have sold tens of millions of copies to people all over the world who know nothing about science, but they know that this man is truthful to an extent beyond just being believable, that he's involved in some great, important struggle, and that if there ever were a knight worthy of defending the banner, he's the one. Paradoxically, crippled beyond belief, he has to speak through a voice computer implant in his throat. And when we come back from the break, we'll see that the first time that his genius showed in public, he embarrassed Fred Hoyle at a public lecture, not to embarrass him, but to show him that he was completely wrong in his calculations. Let's take a break. When you get your copy of The Nature of Space and Time and begin just reading in it, you'll find a nice little cartoon drawing on page 40 of the monk with the little razor, illustrating the fact that black holes have no hair. And it's extraordinary. Next 3 weeks, I'll try and open it up for you gently so that you can begin to understand what a peculiar threshold we have arrived at coming up for 2006. Roger Penrose is one of the most famous figures in the physics world. He'll be about 75 now and emeritus, retired, and has just come out with 1,100-page book, The Road to Reality. And The Road to Reality is a follow-up to 3 other books of his, which are extremely interesting to see. The first one was called The Emperor's New Mind. That came out in 1989. And it was subtitled Concerning Computers, Minds, and the Laws of Physics. And the issue in the late 1980s was that computer science was achieving such a push so fast that eventually computers would be able to be developed that would take care of all of the mind's functionings. And Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind, is that consciousness cannot be duplicated by computers no matter how sophisticated. That is a completely different, mysterious process. The follow-up to that came out in 1984, Shadows of the Mind, A Search for the Missing Science of Consciousness. And then he came up with a third book, which was 1997, The Large, the Small, and the Human Mind. And included here were several people writing with him. 2 of them, one of them was Stephen Hawking, doing a critique within the book. The other, Nancy Cartwright, who is famous for a book published by Oxford University Press. I'll bring it next week, How the Laws of Physics Lie. So The Road to Reality is the 4th book in this kind of a series that started in the late 1980s, is now by the early 21st century, 2005, has enlarged to where if we skip over the first 962 pages, I want to just give you a kind of a paragraph or so of Penrose so that you can see someone after 75 years of excellence understanding to the nth degree all of the math, all of the physics, all of the astronomy, all coming together in a mysteriousness that has to do not only with consciousness, but in a way which we have come to understand. And that is, consciousness is not a phenomenon. It is not an epiphenomenon. It is in fact a dimension, and when it comes into play, just to use the colloquial phrase, it causes a dimensional shift. But the dimensional shift does not stop there, it only starts there. So that what happens is that any of the phases, and without our phase learning, it is not possible to discern this. Any of the phases then that occur in consciousness are not in a cycle, but they form a differential ecology. So that while there is in space-time a logical forming of structural images known as geometry, in the cycle of nature, geometry can very easily be brought into a symbolic mental relationality with numbers abstractly brought into algebra, so that one can have a geometry and an algebra that are referentially related together. And out of this, you get, at the beginning of the 20th century, some of the most brilliant geniuses that the planet has ever seen. David Hilbert, the theory of algebraic number fields. David Hilbert, the foundations of geometry, which has been in print all the time since it first began. And out of this came an understanding that there was a different kind of space called Hilbert space. And in fact, there are many different kinds of spaces, but Hilbert space, here, an introduction to Hilbert space and the theory of spectral multiplicity. The spectrum in its differential array is, in fact, different from multiplicity. But at the time, this was first written in 1951, and Paul Halmos was one of the great mathematicians. He was at the University of Chicago. Introduction to Hilbert space. All of this was extremely sophisticated at the time, but there has been not just a leap forward, there has been a lunge that carries one literally off the graph. What is doubly disconcerting, it carries one beyond the capabilities of graphability. And that the only way to have an orientation is to learn to fly in something like a zero-mass field with no boundary. Here's this paragraph from Roger Penrose. All of these ideas concentrate on the construction of notions of space-time that takes on aspects of discreteness or quantum characteristics of some kind. That things exist and are what they objectively are, but they are because they are discrete from the general background, but that in existence the general background is space-time itself. And the big beginning of this was, as we talked earlier in science about 6 weeks ago, the mathematician Hermann Minkowski was the first to develop Minkowski space-time, the four-dimensional continuum of space-time that Einstein took and developed in his special theory of relativity and then expanded it to the general theory of relativity, all this by 1915. Penrose writes, "In the remainder of this chapter, I shall describe a quite different family of ideas, namely those of twistor theory, to which I have myself now devoted over 40 years, in which there is no discreteness specifically imposed upon space-time." There is no material. There is no existentiality. There is no ritual whatsoever. There is no karma whatsoever. Now, twister theory, when it was first developed, Penrose and another man named Carter went into depth, and there came out books like this, Twisters in Mathematics and Physics, edited by Bailey and Baston, London Mathematical Society Lecture Notes, number 156, or this from Cambridge Monographs on Mathematical Physics, Twister Geometry and Field Theory. This book deals with the twister treatment of certain linear and nonlinear partial differential equations in mathematical physics. The description in terms of twisters involves algebraic and differential geometry and several complex variables and results in a different kind of setting, which gives a new perspective on the properties of space-time and field theories. That when you have a four-dimensional space-time, it has many different possibilities from space that is objective, separate from time. And even when you bring space-time together, the bringing of them together does something to geometry which is only noticeable when you get to the higher end of saturation. That in the lower levels of saturation, you do not notice that if you consider space and time a four-dimensional continuum, that new properties are going to come out, new aspects. But as soon as you get to the higher end of saturation, you realize that time especially has a dilation, and that space has a truncation. And that as time begins to dilate and space to truncate, on the higher saturations of energies in space-time, as soon as you get to what? To the synthesizing pivot for the idea of space-time, is that it has to have some kind of a base to its continuum and to its form, and the base there is the speed of light. And as soon as you begin to approach the speed of light in the universe, one finds that increasingly now, all of a sudden, you get a blossoming out of expansion and of contraction both. That space will contract, and so rapidly sometimes that it will collapse in upon itself, and that the structure of any existentiality will be obviated by the laws of space-time. That not only will the molecules crunch, but the atoms will crunch, and molecular and atomic structure will not hold, and one will have a complete collapse into a singularity, into a black hole. It became almost impossible to talk about the four-dimensional space-time after Einstein, because if one went to the alternative, which is quantum mechanics, quantum theory, you talked about dualities, and you talked about the wave-particle duality, but Einstein refused to talk that way because his envisioning was that as an artist, And one thing about an artist is that when they make aesthetic forms have a quality that is deeper than existence. Aesthetic forms have a quality that the time-honored way to talk about it was always presence. That presence is a spiritual quality. That's the way people used to talk for the last 35,000 years. That the work of art has a spiritual presencing which is stronger than existential material being objective, because the art presencing can transform the material into something that it wasn't before, into something new, into something magical, something sparkling. So that when human beings became capable of art, and the earliest art that we know of, Paleolithic art, goes back about 40,000 years. When one looks at the Paleolithic art of 35,000 years ago, you see right away that the forms of the animals are not just representational, but that the forms of animals are presented in resonant lines within the forms themselves, resonant sets of the forms grouped together, and that interspersed with these will be especially symbols of presence. And the earliest symbol of presence was just a red splotchy dot. And there will be collections of these red splotchy dots to not just signify, but to engender the presencing of the artist in the aesthetic moment of the prism of the art, which includes the appreciator. Not the observer strictly, but the appreciator. One who now leaves the cultural sympathy with nature and shifts and turns around in himself. The Greek word for that was metanoia. And now aligns his cultural character, his mythic character, with the artistic presencing of the work of art person, the spirit person. And so one's culture now, instead of looking back to nature for identification, one looks ahead to the aesthetic presencing of a spiritual form that contains many possibilities for you, and that the work of art now is able to literally engender a different set and different sets of possibilities that you would have never had you stayed completely natural. It's not that you're unnatural, just like you're not unconscious, and it's not that you're supernatural, as if you were like now some super individual. It's that you have shifted mode from the integral to the differential, and it shows up immediately both in the geometry and in the algebra, in the math, so that there's such a thing as differential equations. There's such a thing as differentiable manifolds. There's such a thing as operators of transforms, and one of the most deep transforms is called the Penrose Transform, which we will get to next week. But far beyond the Penrose Transform, he discovered that if you have a transform of space-time as a continuum, not just in terms of the aesthetic presencing, but that there is a further thing that happens, that the universe does not just stay universe because the individual as an aesthetic art form, as a spirit person, can now not only have the culture relate to the art, but the art can also look forward to its own kind of differential, expanded resonance, and that now is the cosmos, which has, in our phases, science, a special quality that is very harmonic with presence. And while there is aesthetic presence, in science there is analytic prescience. It's spelled pre-science, it's pronounced prescience. What's interesting is that both presence and prescience are from the Old French, derived from the Latin. And that in Latin and in Old French, presence and prescience are feminine. They're feminine nouns. Because the forms of art and science are feminine. It seems the most unlikely scenario possible, given all of the habituation from the classical world, the inculcation from the scholastic medieval world, the dogged determination of the modern scientific centuries, that the forms of science should be feminine, that they are. There was always a giving of femininity to art forms. One said that it isn't just the masculine mind, but it's the feminine soul. The Greek word anima means a feminine soul. Sophia is a feminine wisdom. In every language, the high wisdom form is feminine. But in almost all of the developments in civilizations, science is always identified as a masculine idea. And the fact is that symbolic mind is a masculine form. And ideas that it has are masculine forms. But when you make the deep transform into consciousness, consciousness is a masculine process, but it delivers in emergence feminine forms, just like feminine processes of nature and culture deliver masculine forms of ritual and symbol. The doubling up happens in that usually there's an alternation between feminine and masculine, between process and form, except that when the mind opens to vision, you have a double masculine. You have a masculine form and a masculine process, which is unheard of, and that's why the interface between them is exactly zero. It's sometimes called in classical Hellenistic thought the rest. Jesus in many of the esoteric early, before the church began to work doctrines out of things, the phrase was, "Enter my rest." And when you do, you will be able to be in me and I will be able to be in you. And what it is an interchange of forms in a feminine way. You'll be not born again, but rebirthed. And I will be rebirthed too, because it's a mutuality of exchange, of interchange. And only a feminine form can have that fertility, that birthing. But in science, because it is a feminine form, it means that the process that comes out of the cosmos will be a feminine process, and that's where nature comes. That science and nature are both feminine. One is a feminine form, the other is a feminine process. So in a way, Mother Nature is a convenient way to talk about Mother Nature, who is the mother being like a cosmic mother, the great mother. But the mothering, nature is not a mother so much, but a mothering. And what she mothers is the emergence of all things. And the earliest Paleolithic way in which this was presented is a very large, corpulent, nude woman. The first time we see this sculpture is about 30,000 years ago. And she is holding what would be like a crescent moon, only instead of being a crescent moon, it is like a conch shell spiral, and it is full of all the different fruits and vegetables, all the fertility of the earth. So at the crescent moon, the moon, and the cornucopia are there because this is the cosmos as a mother doing the mothering of nurture for all existential things, giving the nurture for it. So that nature as a process nurtures, and what it nurtures is emergence into existentiality. One comes forth and is. But science as a prescience has its harmonic with art as a presency. And so it is almost impossible to get art without science and science without art. They're not only natural concomitants, they are supernatural harmonics. And only when they are brought together, not as a tuning fork, the mind and body can be tuned in that way. But the arts and sciences have to be the songs, not the tuning of the instruments, but the delivery of the songs themselves. So it's a very interesting thing. The first time that it surfaced in the Renaissance, in the early Italian Renaissance, was the first time that there was a transformation. The old medieval, high medieval idea was that of a university. The University of Paris, the University of Oxford, the University of Bologna, some of the earliest universities in Europe were all from the 1200s, from the 13th century, developing themselves. And in the Renaissance, all of a sudden you had something beyond a university. You had an ability to have the arts and sciences, but they were not limited to departments in a university. They were qualities of the prismatic person. The Renaissance man, the Renaissance woman, embodied the arts and was able to have harmonic affinity with the cosmos as the prescience of the science. And so it wasn't the Renaissance man or Renaissance woman alone, but always in a harmonic relationship with the cosmos as a feminine actuality, but an actuality in an infinite differentiation, infinite possibilities. Twisters were developed in the mid-1960s by Stephen Penrose to have a way to go beyond the limitations that the mind had inherited and accrued over several thousands of years of civilization, habituation, had been successfully challenged by people like Minkowski and Einstein and so forth, but had reached a certain saturation of capability because the reliance was always that one had to be able to go back and have some kind of framed picture, and this would be only natural. Even if you were able to shift your frame of reference to include consciousness, and be willing to let nature be unconscious. When it came to art, all of a sudden you had two of the early frames. You had the ritual existentiality that went out of the frame of reference, and the jeweled kaleidoscopic forms of art come in. But the crisis was there in history, because the historical world is a higher harmonic from visionary consciousness. And where visionary consciousness will make a social world, the process of the historical world is a civilization which is not a noun, but is a very high speed, high energy verb. Civilization is a verb. It means that it is the historical world is a process, a very, very high process that delivers the forms of science that have a distinguishing tone to them, and that is of prescience. And prescience, like presence is deeper than realization. A realization will center itself in the mind, but an artistic, aesthetic moment of presence opens one up completely to openness itself. And this becomes harmonically expanded for the prescience of the cosmos. Not only is the cosmos all, it is all and everything, without limit, without bound. This makes a very difficult thing. So Penrose, just to finish this paragraph, to come back to this, that he's been working on twister theory to find a way to have a new kind of notation in mathematics. And out of it came twister diagrams, sometimes called Penrose diagrams. And Penrose diagrams took their cue from the first person to make a new, not individual, but new artistic person notation for mathematics. And that was Richard Feynman, the person that we're taking. And it is Feynman Diagrams. Here's Diagrammatica, the path to Feynman Diagrams, a guide to Feynman Diagrams, a new hardcover that just came out just this last month, drawing theories apart, the dispersion of Feynman diagrams in post-war physics, that Penrose took the cue of Feynman diagrams and put them into a new kind of math to make twister diagrams or Penrose diagrams, and that these two together form one of the most powerful differential double transforms possible on the planet. And it's akin to this. Feynman learned how to make his own wine. And Penrose learned how to distill that wine into a new cognac. The difficulty is that almost no one can understand it. Because in order to understand it, you have to be able to let go of so many assumptions, so many prejudices, so many habits, that by the time you really do let go of all of these, you are naked in newness that is disorienting. Almost as if you had achieved the singularity of a black hole that has no hair. One of Wallace Stevens' great poems ends with poignant, artistic phrasing. He said, "The good man has no face, as if they knew." It's like a Zen koan. And one of the most interesting Zen koans came from Huangpo, 7th century China. He said, when two Zen masters meet, it's like two open doors facing each other. There's only sunlight and the wind blowing. There's no one there. because not only is existence let go, not obviated, but it's not in the attention, nor is the mind in the attention at all. So it's called sometimes the Zen of no mind. And this Zen of no mind, when it is brought fully into the aesthetic presence of a person who doesn't need either a body or a mind to referent their reality now is able to be like an openness that is open with the openness of the cosmos as a whole. And one understands that the cosmos is not a singularity, it's not a oneness, is an infinite openness. And so what the prism will show is the spectrum of that particular prism in that particular light. But that if you took the entire electromagnetic spectrum, not just visible light, it would have a special kind of very complex spectrum from the cosmos. And we're now, just now, by 2006, ready and able to mature, to see that that spectral analytic has a prescience that goes way beyond the limitations of time and space. Prescience means that you not only know the past and the present and the future, but that the continuum of past, present, and future do not categorize themselves in any integral way. And just as you have in space-time, a line in Einstein's relativity of theory of space-time will, in its own way, curve because space-time curves. So that you not only have just a line, but you have something called a world line. And one of the great physicists of all time, George Gamow, when he wrote an informal autobiography, he called it My World Line. My life is a world line in a conscious cosmos that has presencing and prescience and has a different kind of a charm. He has done many little books, this one on gravity, but the interesting book was done about him by James Watson, the author of The Double Helix, who was a very close friend of Gamow, and this is called Genes, Girls, and Gamow, about the wonderful interplay between Gamow, who was a prized mathematical physicist, and then became one of the first people to understand that what had been developed in molecular biology with the double helix, with the developments of the triple codons, the 64 set of them, was that we are in possession now of a new way to make sets out of not just the way in which existence happens in the body, in the material world, the existential world, and not just the way in which the mind can form this into ideas, but that we now have an analytic set that belongs in a prescient cosmos, the access to which comes from the aesthetic presencing of the spiritual person as a work of art. It is only the artist in reality who is able to go through that door and be at home in reality. Hence the title of Penrose's book, The Road to Reality. It is an interesting thing, and next week we'll go deeper into it and open it up even more. The peculiarity is the paradoxes that build, and the paradoxes are like the clues of the ancient Paleolithic hunter. If you're hunting animals 40,000 years ago, any hunter at that time would know you smell them before you see them. And so you trust your hunting sense to be able to have orientation more by smell than sight initially. And after that, it's hearing And after that, then it's sight, so that the sight is like a light cone of actuality that comes together. In a differential world, one opens it up the other way, and one has indeed an expanding sense, not of the perceptual qualities of sense, but of the resonant harmonics that come in the increasing sets of possibility. And one of the best phrases that one could use, anything is possible in reality, and this is provable. Let's have that next week.